Welcome to this introduction video about Rentman. Rentman helps you to manage your daily operations and improve your workflows, to keep track of your equipment, schedule your crew and transport, and quote and invoice your customers. After successfully creating your very own Rentman trial account, you can fully test it with some example equipment, such as this one, and order test data to get an idea of how everything works and is usually set up. After you have done some successful testing, you can also go into the configurations, click on Empty Database, and proceed to empty the database to get rid of all test data, and then proceed to then either manually add your own data, such as equipment, contacts, crew members, and vehicles, or simply import it by using one of our sample files, or using, for example, your own Excel sheet or anything else that might be on hand to then import your data and get the account set up as easy and fast as possible. When all that is done, you can proceed to create a project where you will eventually plan your freshly set up equipment, crew, vehicles, and at one point again, quote and invoice your customer. Now in the project overview, we can proceed to click on Add Project, where we can now either go with a regular project or transfer project. The regular project helps you to organize an event with a start and end date, while the transfer project helps you to move stock between different stock locations, which for example would be your different warehouses you have. Now with our regular project, we can now either go with a blank project, which is completely empty, or we can save some time and move on with a project template. Now, project templates, such as this one, can be very helpful for recurring or similar projects where you can reuse the same setup and data, such as the time schedule, any kinds of equipment, functions, but also other data such as any kind of tasks that always go into these type of projects. What we can also simply do is select a new starting date, for example, the 17th of this month, and it will automatically readjust the whole time schedule accordingly, and we can just proceed to work on our project. We have now successfully created a blank project, which I now already filled with some data, such as giving the whole project a name, selecting the project type that you're dealing with, but I left the project status as it is. Now, every project that you create where it's not maybe already pre-configured with the project template and therefore the different status has been selected already, always starts in status concept. Now, this status can either be changed manually or automatically according to the steps you take when further working on the project. For example, when you send out a quotation from the financial tab of the project, the status automatically changes from concept to pending. Once your customer then digitally signs that quotation, the status will automatically change to confirmed, and you as the account manager of the project will also receive a notification about it in the Rentman app, your email, but also the browser application, depending on how you set up your notifications. Next to that, we fill in the client as well as the location, which is both something you can set up in your contacts, for example, with different contact persons behind it, any kind of warning text that might be relevant, and also making sure you have the correct addresses, which will be helpful to then later on calculate the distance as well as the travel time regarding, for example, your crew and transport. Down below, we can find any kinds of tasks that can be also then be assigned to certain crew members with a certain deadline behind it, notes, and any kinds of files which we either manually add or will also be automatically added by simply creating them within the project, such as, for example, packing slips, call sheets, quotations, and invoices. On the right side, we can find any kinds of tags we can add to the project, the complete project progress to keep a good overview of how well everything is going, and then of course an overview of the project period itself, which is something we set up in our time schedule. On the top left, you also have a filter for sub-projects. Now, a sub-project can be very helpful when you want to split a main project into multiple sub-projects where, for example, each sub-project might have a different time schedule, but more importantly, for example, a different location. If, for example, you're running a big production where there will be multiple locations involved, you can just add each different location to each sub-project, and then at the end, in the financial aspect of the project, you can also then quote either a single sub-project or the selected sub-projects at once. In the next step, we need to set up the time schedule of our project, starting with the 2 core times for every Rentman project, which is the planning and usage period. The planning period determines the availability of your equipment, whereas the usage period is the amount of time that your customers will be invoiced for. You can also add any other times by simply adding a time over here on the top right, such as, for example, production days, breakdown and setup of your equipment, or any other relevant times, which will then also be visible down here below in your timeline, where you can also easily make changes to it depending on how you see fit. Now moving on to the equipment tab of the project, which allows us to add the items we need for this project. Starting on the top right, we can add equipment groups to create an overview of, for example, the different kind of equipment we will be adding to our equipment list, which will later on also help with the overview in the warehouse and any kinds of documents you might create. In our example, we went with the equipment group lights and sounds, where we also added, for example, different comment lines in between, which will help, for example, with the different rooms where equipment might have to go to different locations of our project. On the left side, we can find our entire inventory, and we can proceed to add the items we need and adding them to the dedicated equipment group. We can do so by selecting either a whole group of items or just the single items and then proceeding to adding them to the different groups. Now with Rentman, you have something called single items, which might come with accessories. So in our case, we have, for example, the fog machine, and the fog machine came with the fog shoes, which you can then decide to either add or leave it out, depending on what your needs are. If we click, for example, on details of our fog machine, we can find some more information behind it. More importantly, we can find that it comes with the accessory of the fog shoes, which can be manually added. But we also have bundles of items to help save time and not having to add all the items individually that sometimes go together anyway. So in our case, we have, for example, here a kit. A kit is a bundle of flexible items which can easily be adjusted, such as these ones, with a certain quantity which I can easily change, or also change the items behind it. But we also have something called a case. A case is then a fixed bundle of items that might also be serialized. Now, before we add any of our items, we of course always want to check if they're actually available, which we can do by either hovering over this little icon here on the left, where we can tell, for example, from our 3 different warehouses how much is available in each one of them during the project period. Or we can also open our timeline, which will give us a more detailed overview, for example, from each warehouse. But we can also see from here, first of all, how many are available during a certain time period. In our case here, for example, on equipment on hand, we have 10, but at this very moment, one of them is planned for another project, so therefore available would be 9, which we can tell is, for example, our sub-project that is sold into in Vienna, which we can tell that one of them has been taken out from our own stock, but it could also very well be that we sometimes sub-rent or have any kinds of repairs going on, which would then also be visible in our timeline. So anything that might affect our warehouse stock can be visible in our timeline, which makes it a very powerful tool to really go into depth look of the availability of your equipment. Now that we have added all of our equipment, we now notice that there might be a shortage on one of the items. We can see so that, for example, one of our equipment groups has a red warning, and it also tells us there's a shortage behind it. If we now, for example, open this equipment group up, we can find that our DJ kit has a shortage, and it is because of the item, the CDG 3000. We can now simply solve it by either right-clicking on the item or clicking on the three dots, and then clicking on the button Solve Shortage. This will give us a nice overview, first of all explaining why we have a shortage. In our case, we planned a quantity of 10. Available for reservation, we only have 9. Then therefore, we have a shortage of 1. And it then gives us a rundown of the options we now have to just very simply and effectively solve the shortage. We can either go with an alternative item, sub-renting internally, which means, for example, taking some of the available equipment from another warehouse, or doing an external sub-rental where you might sub-rent from a supplier or partner of yours. Going, for example, with the alternative, we can now very simply select the one that is actually available, then deciding to either replace everything with it or only replace the shortage, which is 1, and keeping 9 of the original item, and then choosing to replace it. This immediately solved our shortage by keeping 9 of the original item and adding 1 of the alternative items. Moving now on to our crew and transport area. Now, similar thing, from here on out, we can again create different groups to create the best possible overview. We can either do this by going here and adding function groups, which could be, for example, the different production days, rehearsal days, or also the setup and breakdown of your equipment. What you can also do is you can go back into your time schedule and take some of the times that you have already created here, such as my planning period and production day, and create function groups out of those. Once you've done that, you can proceed to go back to crew and transport and find those function groups now here. And whenever you make any changes in the time schedule, it will also be automatically adjusted here with the function groups in the crew and transport area. On the left side, we can now choose to add any default function for our crew and transport, adding them to the dedicated function group. Now, each one of these functions already comes with certain data, which then results in these estimated data to be created already, which can also then be found later in the financial tab of the project. You can create as many different default crew and transport functions by simply clicking here on the plus and adding them whenever you're working on a project. If you add them in one of the projects, the list will always be taken over whenever you work maybe on another project. And you always create them from here. After now successfully creating an overview of the functions we need for this project, we can now proceed to plan our actual crew members on top of them. You can either jump on the left side in our navigation menu to the crew planner, which will give you an overview of maybe also other projects in a certain time period where you can plan all of them at the same time, or you can select Open Crew Planner from within our project, which will open the crew planner and automatically, if we click on it, filter down to only our test project that we're currently working on and also the planning period behind it. If we now select the Audi engineer, we can now select who to add to his position by, for example, going with our own crew, checking the availability down here below, and then as we can tell, it would either be Alex or Mark who would be available to take this position, and I can now simply per drag and drop put this job to Mark, who will then find himself in the planning of this project, and we can also find that the audio engineer then therefore has been fully planned as we only needed one person for this job. Now, for the next job, of the light technician, we might not have anyone in-house available anymore, and therefore need to rely on inviting maybe some of our freelancers to help us find the correct person for this job. We can now make use of our tags because we do have certain folder structures such as own crew and freelancers, but this still doesn't really tell us who would be a good fit. We can now, for example, select here the tags and then go ahead and select either one tag or multiple of them. I now have decided to go with the light technician job tag because that is the person that we need. And I can now find that, for example, Tom and Jerry would actually be available, showing up in green. And we can also find that the availability shows them in green as well. The availability of your crew can either be set up by you as the crew planner, or your freelancers and also your own crew can also set it up in their own schedule, either, for example, in the Rentman app, but also in a browser application. Now that we have chosen some of our freelancers, now instead of just adding the job directly to them, we can now proceed to click on invite. Now from here on, we're inviting them as a light technician. And here we can now choose from 3 different invitation types to decide how we want to actually invite them. By either requesting the availability for the period of the project, whatever their answer will be, will then adjust the availability in their schedule. But as we can already tell, both Tom and Jerry are actually already available, and then therefore we don't even need to request it anymore. Or we can directly visibly plan them, which will immediately schedule the crew member for this position. But since we are only searching for one person, it will follow the first come, first served principle and will result in an invalid invitation if anyone tries to accept the invitation after somebody already accepted it and then therefore already jumped into the planning of the project for this position. Or we can also proceed to invisibly plan them, which is our last option here, which allows for multiple people to accept the invitation, not knowing from each other, and then allowing me, the crew planner, to choose who I will put in the actual and then therefore visible planning of this position of the light technician. Either way, they will receive the invitation and will be answered via email or, for example, through the Rentman app, which is available on Android and iOS. Now that we have successfully invited both Tom and Jerry for our light technician job and are awaiting the answer for either one of them to jump into the planning of our project, we can now focus on the vehicle that we still need to add for our transport. For this, we can go from our crew members to our vehicles, select the transport, and then check which ones will be available, which is, in our case, all of them. So we can now just add it to our truck, and we can now find that the truck has been added to the transport of this project. Now that we have a better look at it, we can find that the audio engineer has been fully planned. For the light technician, we're still awaiting an answer from either Tom or Jerry, and the transport has been planned with our truck 1. You can also use the crew planner and its timeline below to make any changes to the current schedule of your crew members by, for example, simply dragging a job that has been planned for Amy and dragging it, for example, onto James, who will now be responsible as the sound technician at the Soul Train tour in Berlin. But you can also do other things, such as, for example, now selecting the day that we've now taken away from Amy and marking her, for example, as unavailable because maybe she is off on that day, and therefore selecting it. And now we've successfully marked as unavailable with a note behind it for her and everybody else to see that might have access to this. You can also see any kinds of meetings that might be happening, reservations that already have been made for future events, and so on. After all the planning is done for now, we can then send in the planning on the top right here for the projects that might be in a similar time period where we have not yet sent out the planning or maybe made any kinds of changes to the schedule of crew members that have been planned for those projects. Whenever you plan somebody for a project, you can also make changes to it. If, for example, the audio engineer job now takes longer than needed or it will be postponed, you can also just simply drag stuff such as this one, change the actual timing of it, but you can also, for example, the person who's planned for this project and make some changes to them. You can, for example, put in the travel time that will be needed, mark them as a project leader for everybody to know in case they have any questions while at the location, but also adding a certain cost rate behind it. So, for example, in our case, Mark will be responsible as the audio engineer, and then therefore I will add the audio engineer cost rate behind it, which might also come with any kinds of overtime calculation depending on the hours of input for this job, which is something they can easily register by using the Rentman app. You can also already add any kinds of remark to this crew member for that to know, or leave any kinds of remarks about this person for myself whenever I might want to replan this position. Now back in our project, we can go now to our additional costs, where we can add any other costs that might occur, such as service or maybe some administration fees. In the Financial tab, we can now review the cost, revenue, and the resulting profit and margin. Below, we can also add a total discount, change the total price to, for example, 5,500 instead, which will now automatically add a minus discount as I up the price. And we can also lock the price so that whatever changes now might occur in the project financially, it will not affect the total price that we have discussed with our customer. Back on top, we can now create a quotation by now choosing the right document template for our quotation, which can be completely customized in the document template editor, which can be found again in the configuration. You then also have the option to, for example, hide the content of your kits and cases in the more advanced settings of this document template, adding some more text to it to the already selected document template, and then also, of course, making sure we select the correct letterhead. We can now proceed to generate the quotation. From here on out, you can now check the quotation itself and all of its data and proceed to either download it, print it, or directly send it via email to your customer, who can then digitally sign it. After your customer successfully signed the quotation, and we also received a notification that the quote, 13 in this case, has been digitally signed, a project note has been added, and the status of the project also has been successfully changed to confirmed. In the Financial tab, under the quotations, we now also find a history of the quotations that have been created so far. If you ever make changes to the project, you can now simply add a new quotation to maybe send your customer the latest quotation according to the changes that have been made. Talking about changes, any kind of changes that you might make inside your project will also be visible in the history log, where we can simply select and find what kind of changes has been done by each of the crew member that had access and then therefore worked on this project. Going back into to the General tab of the project, we can now find that the project status has indeed automatically changed from concept, automatically pending, once we created the quotation, and then once it got digitally signed by our customer, it changed from pending to confirmed, which will now also make the project visible in the warehouse whenever the planning period is beginning. And then on the right side, we also find the project progress, where we find that all of our equipment has already been reserved. With the current transport, we're still waiting for 2 invitations to be accepted. but the quotation has been signed and not all tasks have been completed yet. Down below, we find the files that we have added to our project itself, and also the files that have been created within the project, such as the quotation and the signed quotation, the note from before, but also a note during the digital signing process. Now that we have completely planned our project, we can move over to the warehouse overview. Here we can now prepare and book equipment to the location of the project, and at one point mark all of the equipment as either fully returned, but also, for example, lost or damaged if that ever occurs. For all of the processes in the warehouse, we can either use the browser application as we see it right now, but we can also make use of the Rentman app, which is again available on iOS and Android. The Rentman app has the benefit of including an integrated scanner that allows your warehouse staff to use the mobile device to scan any of your QR and barcodes. And with the right Zebra scanner, for example, and any kinds of dedicated attachments for it, you can also nowadays scan RFID chips with Rentman, which can be attached to any of your items, such as cables and trusses. If you want to find out more about scanning QR codes, barcodes, or RFID chips, have a look on our website geartracking.com. Here we explain more behind it and also offer all the equipment that you might need for it, such as the RFID tags, QR codes and stickers, but also any kind of Zebra scanners that might be needed to scan them. But again, for QR codes, any kind of mobile device that supports iOS and Android is good enough, as you can just simply download the Rentman app, log in as your user, and then proceed to scan QR codes. Now, moving back to our warehouse overview. Here we can now filter by, for example, the stock location that we are working from, and then proceed to book the projects basically from status to status according to the steps you're taking in the warehouse. So it might go from being confirmed as a project itself, then remove equipment from one place to another, or for example, place it all in a fly case, and then we might move the status of each one of those projects from confirmed at one point to prepped. You also have the option of adding any kinds of additional steps or getting rid of some of them that are already in here by adding, for example, custom warehouse statuses. This could be anything, for example, post-production, quarantine, or anything else you might find necessary to add as a necessary step in your warehouse workflow. Next to adding different custom statuses in the warehouse overview, we also have the option of always creating any kinds of documents, such as packing slips, which we can print out using the digital packing slips whenever we click on the booking screen of working on either one or multiple projects, which again can either be done in the browser application or the Rentman app, but you can also assign certain crew members to work on the different kind of projects available to book in the warehouse. The warehouse, same as other sections in Rentman, allows you to use different overviews to work from, such as in our case right as of right now, the tiles, but also the list overview, giving you complete freedom to customize it to your liking by either adding different columns or adjusting the ones that we have already set in place. Now, with the projects on hand, we can now either select one of them or multiple and then proceed to book the equipment. On the left side of our digital packing slip, we now find all of our equipment we have planned in our project, filtered down to the dedicated equipment group. What we also find is not just our own equipment, but also, for example, equipment that we potentially sub-rented from one of our suppliers or partners, where we can filter by either only our own equipment or the sub-rented equipment, which might show up here in yellow. As you can see, with this one having 4 own items and 16 items that we sub-rented, resulting in a total of 20 items we needed for this project. If we believe that some equipment was missing in the initial planning of the project, we can also simply add in additional equipment by either scanning it or adding it manually. On the right side, we now find all of the equipment that we want to then move to the next status. So as of right now, all of our equipment is on the left side, still in status confirmed, and we now want to book it over to whatever status we choose next. Either the status, for example, prepped, or any kinds of other status that we decide on, for example, directly on location, or any kinds of custom status that we might have added already. Now, as of right now, we're still prepping it, which means that we might now want to add equipment, moving it from confirmed to prepped. We can either move it by just simply selecting to bring it over to the other side, or scanning the QR code of, for example, a dedicated serial number behind the item or the RFID chip. Before we might do so, adding all of our items to the right side of things, we might also consider adding a container to the project. The container is basically or mostly used, in our case, for example, the flight cases. Flight cases can be, for example, be opened, and then we can edit the content of it, and then we can add all of our equipment, such as these here, to this flight case, which then also has its own weight, its own volume, and we can then simply seal and close it, and then it has its own content with serialized content in it as well. The flight case itself can also have its own QR code, and you can also just add all of the items that might have RFID chips inside of them, and then when the flight case, for example, returns from one of your jobs, you can simply go over it with your Zebra scanner to then scan all of the RFID chips, or of course open the flight case, check the equipment, and then maybe potentially scan the QR codes whenever you scan equipment back into your warehouse. Now that we have booked all of our equipment from the left side, status confirmed, to the right side, in status prepped, our project itself and the status behind it also finds itself in the status prepped. For example, also the account managers to know how advanced the project is at that very moment. We can now go back to the overall project overview, where we can also now find the project that we just worked with in status prepped. Now that we have successfully booked one of our projects, we also might run into the scenario where we want to book equipment back into a warehouse. So it was out on a job, but now comes back. Now, in our case, we actually find that one of our projects has some delayed items behind it. If we click here on details, or also can find it here in the warehouse status equipment, we can find that there's still 3 items on location, while 33 have already been returned. Now we can also find a note down below that the delayed items will be returned this afternoon, which was already in the past, so this was always supposed to happen. By simply double-clicking on the project, we can jump into the digital packing slip, where we can now find that these items here on the left are still on location and then therefore did not return on time to our project, while all of the items here on the right side have already been successfully returned into the warehouse. Now, the items on the left side we can find also have dedicated serial numbers, for example, but in our case, if, for example, they do not return, we can mark them as lost, or maybe they actually do return to the warehouse but are somehow damaged or completely broken down, then we can also report them as defective, create a report for it, which can then also be used to potentially charge the cost to the customer if necessary. Thank you very much for watching. I hope this answered some of the questions that you might have, but of course, always feel free to reach out to our support team or the person you might already be in touch with, and we will happily help you. Until next time.